Victory! Bully bank runs away from politicians defending people. Even the European Union elites now oppose going cashless. Defence review is creeping fascism, subjugating all of society to war. And Morrison and Sinodinos join the pigs at the war cash trough. Coming up on this week's episode of the Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report. It's the 11th of May 2023. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by Citizens Party researcher Richard Bardon. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Robbie.
In this week's show, we have some major victories to announce, especially the big one when you make a bank back down. So we're going to talk about what Westpac's decision this week. We're going to give you a very fascinating update from Europe on their push to go cashless, but how when the whole thing's discussed openly, people, even elites, change their mind. And then Richard's got a briefing for us on the Defence Strategic Review, which people would have heard about in the last few weeks. Someone has to do the dirty work of reading these things. That was his job, so he's going to brief us on that. And finally, we have an update on our discussion a couple of weeks ago about the pigs at the trough of war, because the former Prime Minister has now joined them. All right, and we're going to keep it all under an hour. Before we continue, remember, let's help get this show seen far and wide. So like the show, share it as widely as you can on all your social media and emails and whatever. Subscribe, and if you're not a subscriber, and if you do, make sure you ring the bell icon so that you get notified of updates of this and other content, such as the breaking news from this week. Also, please comment. The comments are very important. We appreciate the feedback, so make comments below and discuss with each other. And finally, we're about to announce a very big victory, and I'm going to tell you how it came about. This is what our party does. This is what the campaigns we fight are capable of doing. We need your support. We really, really do. Please click on the donate button below and help us out financially to help make this operation work. We're the only political party in Australia that's funded entirely by the people of Australia. Not the taxpayers, not trade unions, not corporations, certainly not the banks. And we're the one, because we're funded by the people of Australia, we represent the people of Australia. We are the Citizens Party. So you can please help us that way. All right, that said, let's get into it. Victory. Bully bank runs away from politicians defending the people. And we're talking about Westpac. I just love every aspect of this story. So Westpac has had a meltdown. Our party worked with Dale Webster, the independent journalist, Martin North, the banking expert, to get up an inquiry in the Senate into banks closing their branches. And we wanted people to understand the details of this situation. This issue are not as the truth is not as the banks have presented it, right? The banks claim that they're shutting branches because no one's using them and these branches are unviable and everyone prefers digital technology, etc. Well, the scrutiny they've come under just since February with this inquiry so far, just that much scrutiny, has made one bank, Westpac, cut and run. They've had a meltdown. Essentially, Richard, what they've done is they've said to the Senate inquiry, here's your branches, stop picking on us.
Yeah, leave us alone.
Leave us alone. So here's what's happened. Next week, today's like I said, the 11th, so next week on the 17th, Westpac was summoned, invited, probably it was applied away, but essentially when you get invited by a Senate committee, you should go, was invited to go to Cloncurry for the next hearing, the second hearing of the Regional Banking Task Force inquiry.
Which, for those who don't know, is up in northwestern Queensland near Mount Isa.
Yeah, so I've discovered that too, because I'm going to be there. So next Tuesday I'm flying to Brisbane from Melbourne here, and then I've got to catch a plane from Brisbane to Mount Isa. And that's a pretty long flight. And then I've got to drive a bit east to Cloncurry. So they were supposed to, the reason that the inquiry hearing is being held in Cloncurry is because Cloncurry is where Westpac has said they're going to close a branch, right? So the first hearing was held in Sale because Westpac had said they were going to shut the Sale branch. The second hearing is being held in Cloncurry because Westpac had said they're going to shut the Cloncurry branch. So Westpac got this letter from the committee and said, please come to the hearing, we have questions for you. Westpac replied to that letter with the following, I won't read it out, but the essence of the reply was this: we decline your invitation to appear because we have nothing more to tell you than we already have given you in the last hearing and in our written answers. Now that straight away, Richard, is quite extraordinary. I don't think a normal person, if the average citizen or the average small business was invited to attend a Senate hearing, asked to attend a Senate hearing, would be able to say no, right? Westpac thinks it can say no, but Westpac had a plan. And the plan was in the second paragraph. And the second paragraph said, we've decided to not close the branches, the 8 branches that we'd planned to close. And this was the big news. So the 8 branches that this inquiry has saved are in the following towns: Gatton, Cloncurry, Ingham, Tully, Denmark in West, so those 4 are in Queensland, Denmark in WA, Kingston in South Australia, Robinvale and Sale in Victoria. Westpac has basically said, look, we don't want to do this anymore. Keep your branches. We're going to keep them open. Get off our back, right? Now, I saw this unfolding in the sense that because I attended the first hearing, I'll make this point. There were 2 banks testifying at that hearing. The first one was Westpac. The second one was National Australia Bank. The attitudes of the officials, the executives from both banks, were very different. The Westpac guy actually looked embarrassed. And you can go back and look at our show, the Citizens Report from after the 2nd of March. I would have said that in that hearing, when I reported back from that hearing. The Westpac guy looked embarrassed. The NAB executive, Chrissy Jones, a woman, she's an ice queen, mate. She had ice in her veins. She didn't care how she sounded. But I saw the Westpac guy looking quite embarrassed. It was as if he knew that saying out loud in front of the victims, in front of the people whose bank he was taking away from them, didn't sound as good as how it sounded in the boardroom when they planned it, right? And that was real pressure. They felt the pressure. You could see them. He was getting redder and redder and redder as the questioning went on. They didn't want to go through that again, right? Now, I'll come back to National Australia Bank in a minute, but this is people power, but it's more than that. And I don't say, because it's easy to say people power. I mean, assume what we're trying to do, people, is get you to know the power you have and do something with it. But people power, you can call a mob running amok people power. What we're trying to get people power to be is actually engaged in the political process. We have a political process in Australia. We're governed by a constitution. The parliament is very, very flawed, but there's an aspect that's workable in it if the people engage. And we try and get the people engaged in this process. That is actually what's worked here, because only what's happened is the people have got engaged. We got up this inquiry, and this inquiry has got politicians to actually do their job. And their job is something that's foreign to them in this regard. We have a culture in Australia, and Richard's job is to read all the newspapers, and every morning he gives us a briefing on the latest breaking news and swears a lot. Because most of the time, the things you see politicians doing are quite pathetic, right? You see what is in the interests of the people, but that requires them to stand up to the corporations. And how many times, Richard, do you see politicians standing up to corporations?
Well, until just lately, not at all, really.
No, pretty much. It's a culture, right? Like, even with this banking closure thing, the default position I've received from so many politicians is, yeah, but we can't tell, commercial businesses what to do. Well, and our attitude was, who said you can't? Especially given that the taxpayer gives as a gift a lot of money to these banks. They exist because of the support of the taxpayer. There must be a trade-off for that. But even then, the politicians admit they have a social licence. Well, a social licence means they've got to act responsibly. Individual victims do not have the power on their own to say to the corporation, like in this case the bank, you are acting irresponsibly. They can say it, but the bully bank isn't going to listen. That's why we invented governments, so that collectively we can be represented, and that is the most powerful institution in the land. And when the government says, I represent the people of Australia and you are screwing the people of Australia, I'm going to tell you to stop, that's government doing the right thing. And this has happened in a mild way, a fairly fledgling way in this inquiry so far, but it has happened. And the proof it's happened, you've got to contrast to what happened last year. Last year they had a regional banking task force, and this was set up by Michael Sukkar, the Liberal Member of Parliament, and Perrin Davey, the National Party Senator. And that task force was supposed to look at this. They set it up as a pre-election stunt, and what did they achieve? Nothing. And the reason they achieved nothing is because they didn't intend to. When they set up the task force, we'd already had a fight with Michael Sukkar over the cash ban. He's the guy that wanted to ban cash transactions over $10,000 and send people to jail for spending their own money in order to please the banks. We knew who he worked for. He's the guy, if you are trapped in debt right now because you bought a house after August 2019, he's the guy that you should be suing because he's the guy, the assistant treasurer, who said you should go out and buy that house.
Yeah, go out and borrow. That's our message, he said.
And most of those people are now trapped in that debt, unpayable debt, because they listened to him. And when he said it, he wasn't doing it to benefit you, he was doing it to benefit the banks. That's who Michael Sukkar is. So he took command of this process. When they set up the task force, 8 of the 11 members represented banks. And what did they do? They ended up rubber stamping the bank's agenda to shut branches. And in the wording of the report, etc., they just accepted the premise of the bank's reasons. They just accepted them. This inquiry was the opposite, because you got people on it, especially the guy who initiated it, Gerard Rennick. Gerard Rennick is a very honest senator in Queensland. He responded to this issue and he set up an inquiry that was quite powerful. And what it said to the banks is, you explain to us your reasoning. You account for what you're actually doing here. Also account for the impact you're having on the towns. And under that scrutiny, Westpac has wilted. And it's all because the process of Parliament doing its job rather than bowing to the banks is what's taken place here under people power, right? So that's what we're trying to do when we want to set up a national bank, when we want to set up a postal bank. We want to bring the power of government, that is powerful and it does exist, but only when it is answerable to the people and does things that are in the interests of the people is it used properly, right? And we want to make that a permanent part of the banking system.
Yep. And as we've said on this show before, if the banks were telling the truth about their reason for closing these branches, they would have no problem with that.
Exactly.
They don't want the branches.
It would go by unnoticed.
Yeah, just not even a ripple.
Now, here's something else, Richard. This is going to have an enormous knock-on effect. Now, we can't predict how this is going to play out yet, but last week, the Westpac branches in the towns of Gatton, Cloncurry, Ingham, Tully, Denmark, Kingston, Robinvale and Sale were unviable branches. Why would otherwise a commercial business close a viable branch? They must have been unviable, right? Yet suddenly this week, they're now viable businesses. They're viable branches.
Magic.
What changed? What changed, Westpac? Is there a mini economic boom in those 8 towns around Australia that justified this decision? Or is it possible they were viable all along? And of course, that's the bottom line. They were viable all along. This was never about the commercial reality of running these branches. What this was about is the banks at the top level, similar to banks right around the world, have decided that their future, what's in their interest, is to be fully digital, have a fully digital banking system, because there's so many more benefits for them with a fully digital banking system, right? There's 3 ways they enhance their profits. First of all, they cut a lot of expenses of maintaining branches and the face-to-face service. That's just gone, right? So that's staff and that's buildings. They can just get rid of those. Second of all, they get all of our data. So every transaction you make, the bank knows what you're doing. And then they can do all sorts of stuff with that, including their AI predictive rubbish, right? Where they'll predict what you're going to do with your, where you're going to spend your money next, right? And you'll be like the Facebook thing. People started, noticing with Facebook that you're talking about some product you're interested in. The next thing it shows up on your Facebook feed as an ad, right? All this is very, very sophisticated stuff. So they'll be able to do that. And then the third one is take a cut of everything. They'll just program it in. Everything they do, they take a cut of.
I mean, they already do with PayWave and things like that, the systems they own.
Exactly. And if you don't have cash and you can't avoid that and everything's digital, then that's what you do. Oh, I got to report this. Look at the comments under last week's show. Oh, this was great. Last week we talked about Westpac, the same bank, in the Fin Review, to James Ayres, bragging about how its solution for regional towns is totally cashless towns.
Yep,
right?
cashless towns.
And remember, it used the example of the country town horse race, right? And it says, you have these horse races in the country towns. There's always cash around, and there's a security risk, and you don't have to have that if you have no branches. We pointed out that's only a security risk because Westpac can close the branch. If the branch was there with a vault, people can bank it, no problem, right? But then I pointed out, Richard, that the other problem with Westpac's logic here, of course, is the communications infrastructure. And what happens, even if they have good infrastructure, when you have a lot of people come to an event and they're all using the internet at once, it drains the bandwidth, right? And
just bottleneck.
Yeah, there's a person made a comment under last week's show. She actually testified to that happening in her town. The event comes to town, nobody's internet works anymore because everyone's trying to use it at once. Westpac's, this is how out of touch, I mean, I just knew that off the top of my head, by the way. This is how out of touch these Westpac executives are when this guy said that. Oh, that's the solution.
They've all got a 5G tower outside each window of their penthouse apartment. They don't care.
No, exactly. Anyway, so now back to the viability of the branches. Westpac has taken away the fig leaf. They've announced they're keeping open branches that were viable all along. Now, I was on 6PR radio a couple of nights ago in Perth because they were very excited about this. Ollie over there who does the drive time, he had interviewed me earlier about this issue. He gets a lot of talkback radio is very interested in this because they get the complaints calls. Again, proving that the banks are lying when they say that everyone wants to go digital, right? They were really excited about Denmark. And Ollie asked this question though: if Westpac can keep these branches open, what justification is there for any branch closures? And that's the point. And now, NAB, ANZ, and Commonwealth Bank, who want to push ahead with their branch closures, mark my words, they are now in a harder position to justify it because their fellow Big Four bank, under our pressure, has bailed on them, right? Now, NAB is going around, look at what NAB's doing. They've gone around and cut back the hours for 64 towns in Australia, the NAB branches. And we said that means they're going to shut the branch. The first one to prove that is Biggenden. Now, Richard, it just so happens, Richard's from Biggenden. I'm from Childers, up the road, right? So we actually come from the same part of Queensland originally. The Biggenden branch is now on the NAB chopping block, and that's the first of this 64 list of banks that we pointed out. And NAB wants people to believe that the Biggenden branch is unviable, and now they're going to have a harder time explaining that.
Yeah, I mean, and anyone, it's the only one for miles. I mean, there's a NAB branch in Childers, so that's 50-something k's in one direction, but there's no more around for...
But they don't, and there's a few thousand people in your town, right? But they don't just serve the few thousand people. All the industry around goes through the bank.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from a farm just inside the old Shire boundary, and yeah, that was where we always went to do. I used to play on the steps of that bank as a kid while my dad was inside trying to sort out whatever the latest thing the finance company was doing. So yeah, but everyone from all around the small towns in that area, they all come into, or used to come into, either Biggenden there or Gayndah if you're further inland. But
and they've already shut the one in Monto, I was informed. So
yeah, which is a bit further north up the North Burnett area there.
Yeah, that's the other point. A lot of these branches that are left are already the ones that are left over from a wave of branch closures, right? So anyway, NAB's going to be pushing ahead with that. ANZ, when they were asked to pause their branch closures, they said to the committee, oh, no, this is the one we made most fun of. They said, oh, no, we can't pause the branches that we've planned to close because that would be too disruptive for the communities and for the staff.
Oh, well.
Like, for their sake, the ones that are going to lose their job and lose their banking services, we have to keep doing this.
Yep. Well, now, again, Westpac's kind of knocked that into a cocked hat for them, haven't they?
Absolutely. And the other and CBA. So CBA we've actually spoken well of until now because CBA was the bank that first said straight away, yep, we'll pause branch closures pending the outcome of this inquiry. And now they're going to be under pressure to keep those ones open permanently, which is great. But CBA in the last little period has tried to create a loophole, and they've announced they're closing the Nerang branch on the Gold Coast. Now the thing with the Gold Coast is CBA's excuse was, oh, that's not regional, and this is just them looking. This is them being a bank, showing their true nature. They want to shut branches, right? They pledge not to shut regional branches, so they've picked a branch that they can say, oh, that's not regional. Except, as Dale Webster, the journalist, has pointed out in this article, by their own literature, they actually describe Nerang and the Gold Coast area as regional, right? By their own literature. So this is just them cherry-picking definitions to suit their purposes.
Yeah. And Nerang's another one of those places. It's on the sort of outer fringe of the metropolitan area of the Gold Coast, and it services all these small communities out in the hinterland there and up in the hills in places that don't have internet. I was talking to a guy from up there, as it happens, just the other day. So yeah, they had to get they had to buy a Starlink connection because nothing else worked, and they're just up a hill somewhere in the back blocks, just above major population centres, but there's no internet.
And can I say, okay, and you've just reminded me of something. People may notice right now, the Australian Banking Association is running ads to warn you about scammers, and the ad is saying there's some poor guy sitting on the steps, financially ruined. And the message of the ad is the bank will never call you and tell you to transfer money, right? That's what the ad says. The thing is, now that's good to learn. You know, take that seriously. If a bank calls you and says transfer money, know you're being scammed. However, what you should know even more strongly, what the ad should be saying is, if you have a financial issue and it's genuine and the bank calls you, the bank will only ever call you to tell you to come to the branch and sort it out. That's what the ads should be saying. Why aren't they saying that? Because the banks want to shut the branches. They don't care that you're being scammed. They're running, these ads are cheap to them. This just absolves them more. Now that they've run ads telling you that if you've ever been called to transfer money, that it's not true, that absolves them more, right? This is them covering their butts. Whereas if they were genuine, this is what branches are for. Yeah, let's use the convenient communications technology, digital technology, but the branch always has to be there to provide the actual service that you need, which can solve those problems. You can actually deal with a lot of financial fraud that way, right? So anyway, so when CBA wants to just cherry pick definitions, this is their default setting. They have an agenda they're pushing through on, and there will be a knock-on effect from Westpac's announcement here, right? And we'll see how that plays out. But final comment. Yes, this is people power. So stay engaged with this. Those of you who have participated in this campaign, you're the key. You've played the most important role here. There's a lot of politicians around Australia jumping up and down right now to claim credit for this decision. A lot of them. Liberal Party and National Party politicians.
And even more reporters and radio announcers.
Yeah, radio stations.
Who actually do deserve some credit.
Look, I'm happy for them all to want to own this decision. This is a victory, and it's good they want to own it. But if you've been a regular viewer of this show, we did this. We took the running, working with, like the work Dale Webster did has been extraordinary. She laid the foundation for the best understanding of this. We started getting that message out to absolutely everybody. Martin North and Dale Webster took the initiative to write to the committee and ask for the inquiry. Senator Gerard Rennick took up the challenge of getting the inquiry up, even involving stepping on the toes of his own LNP colleagues because they had just done this garbage regional banking task force. He got up this inquiry, and now we have a proper parliamentary process and it's working. But that started with the people on this show doing it. And so take heart from that, give yourself a pat on the back, but also understand it's not just the broad people power idea, it's the idea of what, in principle, we're looking at on all issues, getting the parliament, the parliamentary process to work, getting the parliament to do the right thing, because the parliament is where our power is collectively represented. Individually, we're nothing against a Westpac. Nobody is. They're a big, massive bank. Collectively, that building in Canberra has more power than all of them if it chooses to use it. And this also relates to the other issue we talked about last week of the Reserve Bank. This is why the Reserve Bank fight is so important that we talked about. Jim Chalmers wants to give up his power to overrule the Reserve Bank's decision, the power that Curtin and Chifley fought so hard for all those years, right? And enshrined in law 78 years ago. No, you don't. The government has to be the ultimate power, and we have to make sure the government is accountable to us. All right, let's move on. This next one is related. We'll just cover it quickly though. This is sort of breaking news. Even EU elites now oppose going cashless, and the essence of this, Richard, is the European Union is now debating a €10,000 cash ban, very similar to what they tried to enforce on Australia back in 2019-20. Our mate Mr. Sukkar that we talked about earlier. There's a lot of talk about. There's a lot of reporting about this now. A lot of discussion. Some of the reporting, though, has noted, some of the European reporting discussing their proposal for a cash ban, has noted that Australia voted the proposed one down here in 2020. Now think about what that means. Because we ran that campaign then with John Adams and Martin North, etc., and got that defeated, and Senator Malcolm Roberts moved the motion to have it thrown out of Parliament in 2020. Because we did that, now that this is being discussed in Europe, the people in Europe that are opposed to it can point to what we did in Australia and said, see, the Australians didn't want this. If we hadn't have run that fight back then, that'd be a totally different story. They'd be saying, oh, Australia's got a cash ban, a cash transaction limit, right? Our action then is making a difference in this debate over there. But that's not the real news. The real news is Brussels Economic Forum is held by the European Union bureaucracy, the EU bureaucracy. And they held it last week. And in the forum, they had a debate under Oxford rules. And the debate was for the motion, this forum believes that a cashless society would be beneficial for people and the economy. That was the motion that was debated. Now, and we'll run you can see the people debating this as I'm talking here. Before they actually held the debate, they took a poll of the attendees. Now, these attendees were the top bureaucrats of the European Union, essentially.
The people who actually run the show.
The people who run the show. This is the elite of the EU. Now, to their credit, when they took the pre-poll vote, pre-debate vote, the attendees voted against the motion 58 to 42. So they already voted it down, right? But, a bit over, 58 to 42 is a good margin, but nevertheless. So they didn't like that idea. Remember, because the wording is, this forum believes that a cashless society would be beneficial for people and the economy. Then they had the debate. Now, the debate was waged between a representative of the Bank for International Settlements, who are the people that we're always talking about here, that, get cooked up cash, bail-in and all that sort of thing, and a gentleman named Brett Scott, who's the author of this book called Cloud Money that I've referenced I read it at Christmas, and I've referenced it in the show a few times this year. And in the book Cloud Money, he actually describes the mechanics of the banking system so you understand what cash is compared to bank money, etc., right? Anyway, so he goes through that. And we'll put a link to the debate below, you can have a watch of it. So they had the debate, goes for half an hour. Then they took the vote, the post-debate poll, and the attendees voted against the motion by an even bigger margin, 72 to 28. And so the thing with the European Union, there's a lot of social engineering stuff that goes through the EU first and then gets held up around the world as, the Europeans have pioneered this, we should all do it, right? So these elites tend to go along with all these agendas. So it was good they were already a bit suspicious, but what this vote shows is even those elitists, when they saw the facts laid out for them the way this Brett Scott did, that was enough to persuade them, no, we can't go down this path, right? So it's just a vote in a debate, but it's actually, but the marginal shift, the shift in the margin was really, really telling, right? The guy who wrote this, there's a journalist named Nick Cobbleshley, and he basically said if even the European Union elites can be persuaded by this, then this is going to be a really, really hard agenda for them to enforce. And that's why we should take heart from that. That's why we need to fight this, because there's a good chance we can beat it, as we've already done so. All right, moving on. Defence review is creeping fascism, subjugating all of society to war. So, Richard, as I said earlier, you bit the bullet and
took one for the team.
You took one for the team. You've studied the Defence Strategic Review, all however many pages of it. Now, so based on what you've briefed me, so Richard's written an article in the latest Australian Alert Service here. Defence Review enslaves Australia to the US war machine. But you highlight, I'll start sort of from the back going forward. You've highlighted there's a recurring theme in the review. Basically, the recurring theme is that it calls for a whole of nation approach to defence. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, they throw this phrase around a lot, whole of government. Oh, you know, we're going to unite the country behind this and that and the other. But in this case, they mean it literally, and they go through, you know, some of the prescriptions in the strategic review. But what they're calling for is to put every economic resource, intellectual resource of the country, every government department at the service of this defence, so-called, agenda to whatever extent necessary. You know, you think about that, you know, what that actually means. What countries that have gone down this road, I mean, people have heard the phrase crossing the Rubicon. Yeah. That's literally what happened, right? The Roman army
was supposed to stay outside the city.
Yeah, the tradition was it disarms, changes back into the civilian clothes, sends all the weapons back to the armory, and then everyone goes back to their farm or their whatever, you know. But on that occasion, nope, the army, the Rubicon's the river, and they marched across it and they installed the dictator and off they went, you know, martial law for hundreds of years.
Yeah. So, and funnily enough, the Americans put the Pentagon on the other side of their river in Washington to have that symbol, except that symbol is meaningless now. Yeah. Because that's what we're following, right? This kind of
this is being
total domination.
Literally prescribed by the Americans. I mean, the lead author of it, I think we've mentioned before, the lead author of it, it's nominally been written by these former Defence Minister Stephen Smith and the former head of the Army, what was his name again?
Angus Campbell.
But the guy who led the team that actually put it together, this Peter Dean, his name is on contract, literally on contract to the US State Department on these couple of projects worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, multi-year research projects about how America can get even more influence in Australia. But that's, as a former Australian diplomat commented on it the other day, and I've put the link in the article there, a gentleman named Dennis Argall, former very senior ambassador and defence official between times, he said this is not a democratic. This is the opposite of what a democracy would do. He said this belongs in a country that's practicing for fascism.
This is an entirely inappropriate, narrow-minded, chauvinistic, militaristic thing that belongs in a country practicing for fascism, the submergence of the civil power and society, submergence under the military imperative.
Yeah, which in this case is the US military imperative. This whole thing is centered around, now it's funny because initially when they announced this thing, they said that the AUKUS submarine, you know, the AUKUS program, the Australia, UK, US Security Pact announced in 2021, that wasn't in the scope of it, they said. But they spend a lot of time commenting on it for something that's not within its scope, but that's the centrepiece of the whole thing. The entire defence, which is basically turning Australia into officially an adjunct to the US military, right? Even if all of these things, even if we actually do get these submarines, only a quarter of them are likely to work at any one time based on the problems that the US fleet, ours is going to be using their technology, at least initially. The British ones are even worse.
Yeah.
The outfit that's supposedly going to build the first of our original model ones in another 20 years or so, if that. But the Virginia class ones that we're supposed to be getting from the Americans first, only a quarter of them ever run at the same time, according to some documents that were leaked to Newsweek a few weeks ago. It was Newsweek. So, but they're restructuring the entire Navy around that.
Yep.
The surface fleet, they've hired a recently retired US Vice Admiral to tell them how to do that, a guy called William Hilarides. They're paying him $4,000 of yours and my and the viewers' taxpayer dollars, 4,000 of them a day.
Good work if you can get it.
As consulting fees and allowances,
But
supposedly.
they describe all of this under the title of achieving our, what do they call it, sovereign capability. As Paul Keating commented a couple of months ago, just dropping the word sovereign into every sentence like a magic talisman doesn't make it real. Yeah. So they use the word more than ever to describe a process which is actually giving up
Giving
our
it away. They might as well, the way they're going, pretty soon they'll just lock the doors, turn the lights out, lock the doors and hand the keys to the Americans and just send everyone home from their jobs on those big offices in Russell Hill in Canberra, where the Defence Department's been for all these years, because they won't be making any actual decisions there anymore. They'll just be shuffling American paperwork.
So we've got a defence strategic review around that doesn't mention AUKUS, but is entirely defined by AUKUS, which is about our alliance with the Americans and Brits against China.
Yep.
An offensive alliance against China, not a defensive alliance against China. Because
it's not just the Navy that they're restructuring, by the way. They're turning the Army into the same. They're modelling it on the remodelled version that's in process now of the US Marine Corps as a light mobile expeditionary force to go and do these island hopping operations like World War II. And scaling back the acquisition of these armoured vehicles, so they'll have one air mobile light armoured brigade basically, and that'll be it. The rest of it is just going to be foot soldiers to tag along with the Americans in their landing craft on their missions.
Yep.
Because they say, well, we've always depended on great and powerful allies for our defence, and we're only secure because of the US military, the US nuclear umbrella, and all of these things. But they're bringing US nuclear weapons here, or at least the government has explicitly said it doesn't want to know whether the Americans are bringing them here or not. That is, you've got permission, just don't tell us about it. They're bringing B-52 strategic bombers here that have been retrofitted. They don't have bomb bays anymore. They're not carpet bombing farmers in Vietnam. They've refitted them to carry nuclear-capable cruise missiles.
Right.
They're bringing US nuclear submarines here that are going to be stationed, rotating through, but permanently here during this entire process, supposedly starting in a few years' time. And whether or not they say they've got nukes on board, everyone, Russia, China, has to assume that they do and respond accordingly.
And so that makes us a nuclear target, naturally, in a war. And remind people again, how much trade do we do with the country that this is all targeted at?
All of it? No. Most of this budget surplus that everyone's crowing about, that was China buying coal and iron ore.
Yeah. So we get yes, that's right. We get these financial windfalls from our trade with China, so that they can actually produce a budget surplus out of their hat. Yet in the next breath, it's that country that they're determined to make us think is the threat that justifies all this, including the $368 billion price tag for AUKUS.
Yeah, well, just for the submarines, let alone whatever else the other pillars of it are, starting with the long-range missiles. And that's the other part where they're saying that all of this defence industry, all of Australian industrial capacity necessary has to be turned to these ends under the control or guidance, or however they put it, of the Defence Department, which means the Americans and the British, but in this case it's mostly the Americans. The universities, the education programs, what they train people to do, that's going to be prescribed.
Yeah.
And at the heart of it all, as I mentioned in the article, are they pretend that this is all about sovereignty, as we said, and they pretend that it's about maintaining the balance of power, supposedly in the name of collective defence. Yet, as an historian named James Curran from Sydney University, who has a regular column in the AFR, points out, those two concepts are antithetical. Collective security, I think I said defence before, is the polar opposite of the old balance of power doctrine. The idea that there are usually two, it's like a seesaw. You don't change anything on either end. You have your spheres of influence that sort of brush up against each other but aren't allowed to overlap, because otherwise, this is the Cold War. Yeah. They used to call it the balance of terror in the Cold War. That was a more accurate term. People lived under the threat of instant nuclear annihilation for 40 years. And people think that's gone away? No. And our government is bringing it back explicitly in this defence review, and they're turning the whole of Australia's economy to whatever extent necessary, which will be pretty much all of it, given we don't really make anything here anymore.
But they've abominated this term collective security to basically bring back
they've conflated,
something it doesn't mean.
Yeah, they've conflated these two opposing ideas of strategic policy, of the overarching regional and global strategic architecture, to create something that's less secure. Or recreate it.
All right. Well, no. Thanks for going to that effort, Richard. Like I said, you can read the details in the Australian Alert Service. But now we're going to move on to a related subject, because when you strip away all the rhetoric about what a grave threat this is and how we have to rise to the occasion, like we're going to fight the Germans to the last man, the last shilling, like it's World War I all over again, etc., etc., etc. When you strip all that away, there's a lot of money to be made. So, finally, Morrison and Sinodinos joined the pigs at the war cash trough. And a couple of weeks ago, Richard wrote an article. He wasn't on the show for that one, though. He wrote an article about a couple of examples. Joe Hockey and Bondi Partners. So Joe Hockey is the former treasurer and the former, but mostly flowing from his time as former ambassador to Washington.
Yeah, which he just finished just recently, last year.
So flowing from that, he's formed this outfit called Bondi Partners, and they're a private consultancy firm lining up business opportunities from AUKUS, because AUKUS means a lot of money is flowing. It's just cash registers are going left, right, and centre.
Yeah,
right?
Mostly our money.
Our money, taxpayers' money.
That's the one mug who's paying.
the reason that the Labor government can't build social housing, for instance. So he's done Bondi Partners. Then there was Christopher Pine, and we had some rather accurate photos of these guys for the show. Christopher Pine has formed Pine and Partners. In his case, it's even more blatant than Hockey, because he was the defence minister.
And the defence materials minister for long, but the guy who's nominally in charge of all of this acquisition process and has all of this inside knowledge of who's who to who.
So now, if you want to make money out of the AUKUS cash machine, you go to Christopher Pine.
Yep, and give him his cut.
We talked briefly about Peter Jennings from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who's now in the private sector with Michael Shoebridge, also from ASPI, and there's thing is called strategic analysis.
And then he has his own, presumably sole trading company too. The sole traders, independent business in his own name, just also already giving paid advice to government departments and so on.
So we're highlighting these because these are the people who, in their time in government and government circles, pushed us down this path where now we're, you know, like I said, our best trading partner, China, is now presented as a threat, and we have to put all this money into combating the threat, and the money goes through these private sector companies. So now we're talking about. I think these next two trump it all, because first of all, one is the former Prime Minister Morrison, under whom this relationship so badly deteriorated,
and who claims to be the architect of AUKUS.
The architect
Claims to be.
We'll give you the details on that. And the other one is Arthur Sinodinos, also the former ambassador to Washington. And we're highlighting him because of the network that he's actually joined. So first of all, with Morrison, two things with Morrison. There is rumour in Canberra that he may be leaving Parliament to take up a job at a British weapons manufacturer. And that is just like, there's one major British weapons manufacturer, BAE Systems, that is making the submarines. There's others that you know, they all sort of work in tandem with each other, etc. How could that even be thinkable, that he walks from being the Prime Minister who basically hatched a deal with Boris Johnson to create AUKUS, to give British weapons companies hundreds of billions of our dollars, and he's going to walk out of Parliament into a job working for them?
Yeah. Well, even by his own ministerial standards that he instituted as Prime Minister, because these things come under, they can be varied by the government of the day, but once they're put in place, they're supposed to be legally binding. They're supposed to be binding on these ministers, and there's, he certainly shouldn't be in there in any related industry to his ministerial portfolio. And remember, this is the guy who had, what was it, 7 different ministries, 5, you know, secret ministries, and I think it was 7 in total, including the Prime Ministership.
He might have made himself Minister for BAE.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it, because so for at least 18 months after he leaves Parliament, plus another 18 months from if you stay in Parliament but you're no longer have those duties, it's supposed to be 18 months plus, and then the 18 months after you leave Parliament, which would make it 3 years, almost 3 years in his case. You know, I suppose, you know, how long ago it was that he lost the Prime Ministership. But as Prime Minister, according to some, you know, legitimate legal readings of those guidelines, he shouldn't ever be involved in any of this at all.
Well, I agree, and the whole country should agree. But what he is involved in, and this is where it gets even more interesting in some respects, is he has joined the International Advisory Board of 2 American think tanks. Now, one of them he joined earlier, called the Hudson Institute, and the Hudson Institute is one of these outfits that is just pretty feral in promoting the whole American, what they call unipolar or superpower dominance of the world, etc., etc.
The neocon agenda, if people know that term.
Yeah. But the other one he's more recently joined is the Center for the New American Security. Now, the Center for New American Security is one of these. There are a dime a dozen of these think tanks. They're all funded by weapons companies, including this one. And in fact, there's a big 5 weapons manufacturers list in America. This is funded by all of them, essentially, the Center for New American Security. But more importantly, it's who it was founded by, and that's this guy named Kurt Campbell. Now, Kurt Campbell he has a position in the Biden administration. He's the Asia czar. I call him the strategy Svengali, because arguably, this whole mess we're now in with China and America and Australia he's the architect of the mess.
Yeah.
Because it started with this decision in 2011 by Barack Obama to pivot, they called it, to Asia. Take their strategic focus off the Middle East, which they'd messed up so badly with the Iraq War, etc., and put all their focus into Asia to confront the rising China. Right? That started in 2011. This guy, Kurt Campbell, is the architect of that. So he was in the Obama, he founded this think tank in 2007 before Obama came in. He's in the Obama administration, gets the ball rolling with the Asia pivot, and then in 2013, he goes and starts another organisation called the Asia Group, same Kurt Campbell, and whereas the first one is that Morrison has joined, the CNAS, is a think tank. The second one is a consultancy, a private consultancy, which is there to make money.
Yeah, commercial operation.
Commercial operation.
To consult on these, on the ramifications of the policies that this guy wrote up.
Exactly.
In conjunction with others, but he was the lead architect of it.
No, exactly. And he's basically set in train the trajectory that it got much worse under Trump, of course, but it was already on that trajectory. We've tried to point that out from the beginning, right? So when Trump came in and he gave jobs to Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, Peter Navarro, I mean, these guys just ratcheted up the viciousness against China and made everything very, very confrontational to the extent that China had to respond to that. But China had already started responding to things thanks to the Asia pivot. One of the things I like pointing out to people is the Asia pivot started in 2011. When you've heard about China in the South China Sea, oh, China's expansionary, China's aggressive, look what they're doing
islands,
in the South China Sea.
Militarising features.
That started in 2013. That was in response to this Asia pivot. That was in response to decisions like Julia Gillard did, which no Australian government had even considered ever before. It was unthinkable then. But Julia Gillard let the Americans base Marines in Darwin, right? When that happened, then the Chinese said, well, you know, you're encroaching on us in a pretty big way. You might, if you shut the Straits of Malacca, for instance, you cut us off from our oil supply, right? We're going to have to take countermeasures, and that's when they started building up the islands in the South China Sea. So, and then that issue has been used so much. Oh, look how aggressive China is. You know, look what they're doing in the South China Sea. Well, this is the guy who got the ball rolling. So he set up this other group called the Asia Group. And what have they just done? They've just given a job to Arthur Sinodinos. So Arthur Sinodinos, the Asia Group website, one of the things they actually tout that they're there to make money for companies. They brag that they got a American defence contract or a top Australian contract, etc. But then this is their press release about Arthur Sinodinos. They say, this is from the 1st of May. The Asia Group is pleased to announce the launch of an Australia practice chaired by former Australian Ambassador to the US, Arthur Sinodinos, and the newest partner in the firm. Ambassador Sinodinos joins the Asia Group as partner and chair of the Australia practice, where he is responsible for developing and executing the firm's business strategy in Australia and supporting C-suite executives from across the Asia Group's geographic portfolio to manage evolving risks and seize emerging growth opportunities. Ambassador Sinodinos' experience in foreign service, particularly at the forefront of Australian engagement with the United States, provides an invaluable perspective, get this, at a time when multilateral engagements through AUKUS, the Quad, and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework are all opening new pathways for commercial engagement. So all those things are things that this guy, Kurt Campbell, has helped to set up in his official capacity in the US government, and now his private think tanks and consultancies are cashing in on those things. And our two of our most senior government people, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, and you've got to look at Sinodinos' CV. He wasn't just the ambassador to Washington. He was one of the very, very senior senators in Australia for the Liberal Party. He was John Howard's chief of staff for most of John Howard's prime ministership. They are now walking from their role as having expedited this drastic shift away, anti-China, against China, into positions where they can profit and help this guy profit from it. This is shameless. Yet at the National Press Club, when Paul Keating gave that interview, Richard, he was asked by Laura Tingle about whether he was conflicted in his attitudes on China because he was the chair of the China Development Bank.
Well, the chair of its International Advisory Board.
And what did he say? He said, yes, that they paid him, for that position, they paid him $5,000 a year to be the chair of the International Advisory Board.
Yeah, basically just to pick up the phone and answer questions that they had about, certain things.
Let me tell you, Arthur Sinodinos and Scott Morrison and these guys that we've been talking about today, they're going to be getting more than $5,000 a year, right? This is real money they're cashing in on, and it all comes from the Australian taxpayer. All right, we've written an article about that in the Alert Service as well. Morrison and Sinodinos joined pigs at the AUKUS trough. Two things before we go. One is a very quick update on Julian Assange. So on Wednesday the 24th, the Quad meeting is being held in Sydney. Joe Biden is coming to Australia. to check out our aged care homes, I believe. Anyway, so the Assange campaign is planning a protest in Hyde Park on that Wednesday from 10 o'clock in the morning to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So there's a Hyde Park protest. If you're in Sydney and the surrounds, or you can get to Sydney, please go along. I don't want to get people's hopes up, but we're seeing these signs that we may actually be at the point of the final, where all it requires is a final push to get Assange freed. And it's not because suddenly our politicians have grown a conscience or anything, but because of the consistent pressure they've been receiving from the public that's been growing. And so the latest on that is last week when Elbow was in London, he did a 6-minute interview on ABC radio. 3 minutes was about Assange. He expressed his frustration on the issue. A lot of what he said was pretty weak, but nevertheless, it was the longest he's spoken about Assange, even before he was Prime Minister, frankly, because his previous statement about Assange was just a doorstop one line, right? This was a detailed conversation. He followed it up 2 nights ago on ABC 7:30. More significantly, Peter Dutton, who is as much a stooge of American power in Australia as anybody in Parliament, Peter Dutton came out on radio and backed Albanese up and agreed that this has gone on too long and must be brought to an end. Peter Dutton said that. So the former Australian Foreign Minister Bob Carr put out a pretty powerful statement where he said, if the Americans ignore the fact that now the government and the opposition leader are saying the same thing, they're treating us with contempt as a country, right? A client state. So it's building. And if you can get along to Sydney on that date to help add to the pressure, please do. The final thing, I want to put a picture on the screen. We had a dear friend of ours who's a very important part of our organisation, Con Michaelides, passed away on the weekend at the age of 76. He passed away peacefully in his sleep. Well, the picture you're seeing there is him playing a guitar, which he took up late in life. I remember when he started learning guitar, and he went from knowing nothing to being very accomplished at flamenco within a seemingly short period of time. I met Con. I joined the CEC then 30 years ago this year, back in January. My first day walking into the CEC national office here in Melbourne, I met Con on the very first day. And he was with this Iraqi neighbour of his who he'd brought into the office, who could barely speak English, and whose name was Sleeman Johanna, who a lot of you will know. Sleeman is now one of the leaders of our organisation, and that's part of Con's legacy. Con was a guy that, he was a member of our family, and he's actually one of the people who deserves credit as being a foundation of this movement. The power that we have now as a movement is built on the support of people like Con. We appreciate him immensely. It's an honour to be able to remember him like this, and just give you a slight glimpse into the sort of people that have supported our party. We appreciate the support of every single one of them, but the ones that you get to work with closest, you see them most. Con never worked full time in our party. He used to work for the public service, but every night he'd catch the train home, and because our office was on his way home, he'd stop in the office every single night. And we got to know him very, very well. So rest in peace, Con. Our condolences to the Michaelides family, and just want to emphasise the we can't honour his contribution enough. But on that note, Richard, back to the issues at hand, which Con would want us to work on. Thank you very much for your contribution today. This has been a great victory, people, in terms of forcing a bank to back down. You did it, we did it, we got the politicians to do it, so let's keep the heat on in terms of the campaigns we've got going. Still on the regional banking task force, and also on the Reserve Bank issue, and making sure they don't take away that power that we've identified in our video. That being said, thanks for tuning in. Thanks, Richard, like I said. Tune in next week for more of the Citizens Report.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.